Thank you very much. I actually like to expand a little bit. I like to say Antarctica to Afghanistan to Hawaii, but it doesn't mean we have correspondence in all those places. So thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here. I have to say, an old friend of Asia House. Every time I go back to London, which is very often, I tend to go and visit, go for talks and to see old friends there. So I'm very pleased to be involved, and the Financial Times is very pleased to be involved in this today as well. So I'm going to introduce our panelists very briefly, and then we're going to get into a lively discussion. I've said more the sort of CNN rather than the Jerry Springer type of discussion. So a little conflict, a little bit of discussion, but no fisticuffs, please. So let's start with John. John Muir is the Chief Operating Officer of ABP. And I've actually interviewed his colleagues, his boss, quite a few times in Beijing. But some of you may not know that ABP is one of the largest, if not the largest, Chinese developer, real estate developer in London. So quite interesting. Next to me here is Thierry de Longomar, who's the CFO of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So talking about Belt and Road Initiative, AIIB is crucial, right in the center and very closely involved in that initiative. Next to me is James Cameron. I was joking before, the director of Titanic, several other famous movies. No, so James is the head of infrastructure and real estate at HSBC, helping companies raise money in those sectors in particular. Gregory Hodkinson is the chairman of Arup, the engineering firm that many, I'm sure, of you will be aware of. And last but not least, Lincoln Leong is the CEO of MTR Corporation. So we've got a very good panel, a very high-end, hard-hitting panel, and I think we'll have a very good discussion. So I'm going to start with Gregory. When you're looking at this region, at Asia in particular, what do you see as the main possibilities for creating sustainable or smart cities? So where are the places you're looking, which countries, and what are the opportunities that you see, particularly for smart cities?
Okay, thanks for that. I'd just like to take a step back about smart cities for a second. I don't know whether this is working very well. Smart cities for a second. A city is smart, in common reference, it's related to technology, information technology, but I don't think that's the thing, really. No,
do you have a hand mic? Just, yeah.
Thanks very much. I don't think that that's the thing, really. A city is smart if it's sustainable, that is, if it survives in the long run. And it's sustainable if it's resilient. So I'd like to address the idea of cities in that context. And cities, we're here talking about Asian trade, and of course cities form really principally as sort of nodes of trade. And the purpose of trade is not just to enrich the traders, but rather to benefit society as a whole. And in this era where we're seeing unparalleled a rate of population growth and urbanization, and unparalleled, and according to the demographers anyway, is a sort of very short-lived phenomenon that we're witnessing, particularly in Asia, but also in Africa. This idea that the population is going to grow rapidly, as it will do, between about now and 2050, and then essentially level off. And that's going to occur in Asia, it looks like, as well as in Africa, slightly later, but still the same kind of pattern. And that means the cities that we're building now need to be sustainable in the way that I defined it. Because if they're not, in this tremendous period over one generation or so where we're building so rapidly, we're going to bake in a model for a trade, a model for economic development, a model for society that's potentially unsustainable. And we all know that we're bumping up against the limits of the planet to be able to support the human population. And this is especially the case in Asia and in Africa. So for me, the question of smart cities is, to be smart, you have to be sustainable. Let's make sure that we build sustainable cities in this once in a lifetime, literally, opportunity and responsibility, because we all know that the cities we leave behind stay there for a very long time. And unless we get it right now, we're putting our children and our grandchildren and their children in real harm. And I think that that's the most important thing that we have to focus on.
Well, thank you. I know that AIIB pays a lot of attention to the idea of sustainability. Your mantra, I think, for a while has been lean, clean, and green. I was wondering, what is AIIB focusing on around Asia? What are your priorities as a multilateral development bank in addressing the infrastructure gap here in Asia, Thierry?
Thank you, and thank you, Asia House, for hosting this interesting meeting today. Before answering specifically to the question, I heard this morning a very interesting comment by Lord Ashdown, who said that we are witnessing the end of 400 years of domination of the West on global institutions, and that there is now a space for a different option where China is now playing a major game. And I'm saying that because immediately I thought of President Xi's initiative in October 2013 to create what was then known as the Asia Infrastructure Bank, which became formerly the AIIB. I'm saying that because it shows the central role that China has taken in dealing with major global issues, including infrastructure, and linking infrastructure to trade. You need good infrastructure to enable more trade within countries, within region, and between regions. Yes, we have three sustainable priorities. One is sustainable infrastructure, one is cross-border connectivity, and the third one is private sector mobilization. Now, sustainable infrastructure, just a number, many numbers have floated around the infrastructure gap. I leave you with one: 1 trillion per year. Yeah. You can think of a lot of literature, but 1 trillion per year. What does that mean? You need more actors. You need the public sector. You need government, who are the main driver of infrastructure spending. You need multilateral institutions like ourselves. You also need the private sector. So it is one of our major priorities. We are aiming at achieving it. We only started 18 months ago. We have so far only approved $4 billion of project, which looks like nothing compared to the 1 trillion gap, but we will thrive to increase our operations in Asia and outside of Asia. And just to finish, there is a confusion. We are not an instrument of the Belt and Road Initiative. The confusion is sourced because the Belt and Road Initiative, then called OBOR, was initiated at the same time as AIIB, i.e. in Jakarta 2013. We may invest in the region covered by the BRI, but we will invest outside of that region also, including outside of Asia.
Fair enough. I would say, I mean, I'm not trying to get into Jerry Springer stuff, but I would say that the Belt and Road Initiative seems to grow every month or two. The countries are all trying to sign on to something that is already in existence. So the country I grew up in, New Zealand, is trying to claim that it's the start of the Belt and Road. Like, a little bit of a hard argument, but anyway. So you may find that everywhere is part of the Belt and Road one day. James, I'd like to turn to you. Where do you see the potential for leapfrog development? Obviously, we're talking about the $1 trillion US dollar infrastructure gap, and some of these countries in Asia are really, really behind. Are there areas where you see real leapfrog opportunities, where there is just no existing infrastructure that countries can leap ahead?
Yep. Look, I think the fascinating thing and the exciting thing for us around the Asian infrastructure story at the moment is that there really isn't a country where infrastructure isn't important and isn't going to be a fundamental driver of how their economic growth develops and how their economic potential develops over the next 20 to 50 years. Both Thierry and Greg have mentioned two interesting elements of that. On the urbanization side, as well as it being the idea that the significant growth that we're having is going to drive significant urbanization, and getting that urbanization is going to be crucial to sustainability. It's also going to be crucial to economic growth. So making sure that that urbanization is done in an efficient and an effective way, such that, for example, in somewhere like Indonesia, we don't just create another 20 Jakartas where you have everybody spending their whole life in gridlock traffic with the pollution and the direct economic costs that creates is going to be fundamentally important. You go through different countries in the region, they're all at slightly different stages of economic development, and their infrastructure stock is all at slightly different stages. When you look at the $1 trillion funding gap, there are some consistencies. Fundamental infrastructure, so power and transport and water, are all consistently needed in different countries. But then you have different nuances within that. Some people need more baseload power. Others need more urban infrastructure. Others need greater connectivity between infrastructure, and then there's the piece around greater connectivity between different countries within the region. So it's very hard to pick out different areas. The scale of the requirement, whether it's $1 trillion, whether it's $1.7 trillion, demonstrates that the need is widespread, and therefore the solutions have to be varied and comprehensive.
Thank you, James. Lincoln, I'd like to turn to you. I was saying to Lincoln just before that I don't normally praise the panelists very much. As a journalist, I'm not supposed to, but I'm a huge fan of MTR. I moved from Beijing to Hong Kong, and I have to say, and I've traveled on the tube in London, the New York subway, I've traveled all over, and I have to say the MTR is the best subway system in the world. Now, to balance that, I've got to ask some really hard questions. So anyway, I'll start off with an easy one. How is MTR seeking to capitalize on the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly in Southeast Asia?
No, and thank you very much for those compliments. As you know, we also run subways in Beijing as well as in London.
So that's a detraction mark, sorry. Lift your game, Lincoln.
No, the Belt and Road Initiative is a very important initiative for MTR. At least 65 countries along the Belt and Road. We also operate in Australia, which we claim is also part of the Belt and Road. For us, first and foremost, our activities along the Belt and Road would focus on the MTR Academy, something that we established about a year ago. The purpose, the emphasis of the MTR Academy is to provide training, information sharing amongst different rail operators, metro operators around the world, particularly in Southeast Asia, and particularly for rail companies along the Belt and Road. So we arrange courses in Hong Kong. We have colleagues from other metro companies come visit us here in Hong Kong to share best practice and really to learn from each other. So first and foremost, it's developing and enhancing the soft skills. Because I think what you find is in many countries along the Belt and Road, they are already building or in the throes of building out their rail systems and rail network. Take Vietnam, for example. Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh are both building out metro systems. So is Jakarta, so is the Philippines, India, Middle East. So what we're trying to do is contribute on as much on the soft side as opposed to just on the hard side. But one other comment I'd like to make is beyond the Belt and Road, we're seeing with urbanization that many of the panelists also talked about, with increased urbanization, we're now beginning to see the formation of city clusters. If one looks at the mainland of China as an example, that area around Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei, over 100 million people, 110 million people. Enhanced connectivity would do wonders for the economic development of that region. Doesn't end there. If you look at the Greater Bay Area, which is something we're very familiar with here in Hong Kong. Imagine Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, large sections of Guangdong province have been connected and people being able to move around with ease in that region. And you're seeing that around Shanghai, you're seeing that around Chongqing, Chengdu. You're seeing that with high-speed rail development between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. So all this really adds not just to the connectivity, but to economic development in all these regions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. John, I'd like to turn to you now. When you're looking at, I know you're based in London most of the time, is that correct? Yeah. So when ABP is looking at where you want to locate projects, what are the main factors that you consider?
Most important is the government. It knows what it's doing, and they have a firm mind on the strategic development.
You're saying the British government knows what they're doing? I'm not so sure. Maybe the London government knows what it's doing. Yeah.
But I think I want to bring it to a high level as well, as it's not just Paddy was saying that we are into a very important moment working with the China government between UK and China, but it has been echoed from David Cameron, Theresa May, and also the Chinese government. UK and China are truly in the golden era. And what that means is cooperation, collaborations. Now, on the back of the Belt and Road Initiative, we need to do something. Infrastructure is the backbone of delivering that. But what is those mean? Golden era, Belt and Road is about trade, business that actually have a sustainable base to grow on. Transportation, train, air, shippings, underground, this is all I call the first layer of infrastructure. But what it actually means and serve is really for business who actually benefit from it. The local area, which is going to benefit from it. And that will create a long-term sustained relationship and sustained development or sustained initiative. And ABP has been chosen by Greater London Authority as the development partner to deliver the third business district in London for a very simple reason, because what we set out for is to build a 5 million square foot of business gateway between Asia and Europe, China and UK. And that is what we are set out to do. And as you know, people in here know, London is the gem of the crown in Europe. Brexit and no Brexit is always going to be the place in Europe that you want to do business. And you want to start with London and radiate your business to the rest part of Europe. And we well suited in the east part of London. And that is the government designated of opportunity. And later on, we got an enterprise zone status for Royal Dock. And that actually gives a developer a lot of confidence to work with the public sector. This is in a way of about private and public working together. Infrastructure by the public and commitment by the developer build a sustainable economic and social cycle in there.
Great, you raise an important point, and I think that's really interesting how you've pointed out how important the government support is for the decision to go into the Royal Albert Docks there and do that redevelopment. I want to ask everyone here, actually, I sort of open it up. I know, we're in Hong Kong, a lot of the people in the room are from Hong Kong, and we write a lot at the Financial Times about the Belt and Road Initiative. We've had some stories recently about how it's maybe not as vast and sort of all-consuming as it's kind of been made out to be. But what really is interesting for me is where Hong Kong fits into this Belt and Road, because I think there's a slight existential angst in the city about maybe Hong Kong is going to miss out on this amazing thing that it should be that it should be taking advantage of. So I just want to maybe ask all of you, and you can put up your hand and at the end, sir, at the end, you can at the end. I'm talking about the panelists first. You'll get your turn. And I heard your question before, so maybe we'll leave it right to the end. No Koreans or Japanese, sorry, but lots of Chinese. Why don't we start with you, James?
In terms of
what is Hong Kong's role in the Belt and Road? What is Hong Kong going to do? I mean, the reason I'm thinking of you first is because the obvious answer is as a financial center. But how does that work?
Look, I think there's a couple of key areas. I think the first point I'd make, I mean, Belt and Road Initiative is going to be one of the major macroeconomic factors that we're going to see over the next 10 years, because it coincides with one of the major macro requirements that needs to be solved, which is around infrastructure. But it won't, Chinese funding won't be the only funding. Chinese developers won't be the only developers that do go into infrastructure, but they will be playing an increasing and a material role over time. I think in terms of Hong Kong's role, there are a couple of very obvious areas. I think the first, as you say, is as a financial center. And there's a couple of elements to that. It's a location for Chinese companies, and we've seen for a long time, Chinese overseas subsidiaries based in Hong Kong, raising funds within Hong Kong or using a base in Hong Kong to raise funds on the global financial markets to support their Belt Road activities. And so we've seen corporates do this, we've seen SOEs do this, and we've seen the banks do this to be able to raise funds, capital, to be able to support Belt and Road activities, both here in the region and more broadly. So I think that's the first place. I think the second point is Hong Kong as a location of expertise. So when you look at the profile of something like Belt and Road, you've got a large increase in Chinese activity, a large increase in the roles that Chinese clients are looking to play in a lot of new markets. In a lot of cases, a lot of those new markets are emerging markets and have relatively bespoke risks attached to them. And so within Hong Kong, both within the financial and in the consulting sector, you have a significant depth of expertise that can facilitate the management and understanding and structuring of those risks within those different investment and outbound opportunities from China. And Hong Kong, in a lot of respects, is a natural place for that to happen because, as I said earlier, it's always been the springboard, the location that Chinese companies have used for their international subsidiaries when they've viewed the rest of the world. And I think Hong Kong has taken a lot of steps over the last few years, both to position itself as that facilitator, both encouraging things like the One Belt, One Road conference, etc. here, where a lot of people come together, but also through organisations such as IFO, where you're looking to try and bring together a lot of those different areas of expertise that are going to be required to able to facilitate and enable China outbound investment along the Belt and Road.
Does anyone else have anything you'd like to add about Hong Kong's role?
Just two things. At the last Belt and Road conference that was here in Hong Kong, it had the clear endorsement from Beijing of a particular role as it related to looking both ways internationally as well as into China in professional services because of the things that James said, and especially in through ASEAN. So the road part of the Belt and Road. Not the belt part.
Paradoxically, I'm sure you're all aware, the road goes through the water, the belt is on the land.
Yeah.
Maybe Hong Kong can help rebranding One Belt, One Road, or Belt and Road. Yeah.
When I was growing up, I remember as a teenager, my sister had a belt that had lots of tassels on the end of it, and one of them might have reached to New Zealand.
Or came from New Zealand.
Thanks for that. Lincoln, do you have any other thoughts about, because at the conference, a recent conference I was at with Thierry actually, there was a lot of talk about how maybe MTR could leverage this Belt and Road even more. That, is the central government in Beijing helping you, for example, and suggesting government to government that you should be more involved in some of these countries?
Well, I think looking at it from a more macro perspective, getting back to your question of how Hong Kong can further participate in the Belt and Road Initiative, I absolutely agree that from a financing, from a software, from a consulting perspective, there are lots of opportunities, myriads of opportunities for companies based in Hong Kong and companies around the world. I think another aspect, which is what we have started doing a little bit of, is acting in some ways as a connector. Some people use the word super connector for Hong Kong, but it's a connector connecting and perhaps working with other companies, be that in the mainland of China, and going into Belt and Road markets. So for example, about a year ago, MTR signed an MOU with China Rail Corporation. That cooperation between ourselves and CRC really looks to see how we could work with China Rail Corporation and support their development outside of the mainland, particularly in high-speed rail development.
They can do the hardware and you can do the software. And,
we could do that, and to bring in other aspects from different business models. So for instance, we have a value capture business model that may be suitable for countries along the Belt and Road.
I want you to talk about that because one of my questions is about that value capture. I don't want to focus on you too much, but tell us a little bit about that. The what do you call it? It's R+P, the Rail Plus Property model, and how is that? How can that be adapted, do you think, around this region?
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's a model that's been in existence for centuries. In fact, it dates back from the UK. Remember the days when you used to have railway hotels above or adjacent to rail stations? Same concept. This concept of so-called rail and property is a value capture model that captures adjacencies and turns adjacencies and value add from those adjacencies. In our case, it could be property development, and internalizes it within the company. So what we do here in Hong Kong is, in addition to building out the rail system and the stations, the tunnels, as well as the depots, we put property development above those stations, above those depots, and we capture value and share that value with our commuters, as well as Hong Kong government and the property developers.
Am I right in saying you're the biggest property owner in Hong Kong, or is that wrong?
No, that can't be right. I think everyone looks at MTR. We are a rail-based company. Property is a very important part of our business model, and that important part of our business model has us cooperating with property developers in developing those adjacencies. A number of people have asked us, well, building a 80-story skyscraper above a rail station may not be suitable for our city. And they could well be right. I think in many ways it's horses for courses. At the end of the day, value capture could be as simple as putting more shops in a station. It could be leveraging of advertising, or it could be having a small development adjacent to a particular station. It need not be on the scale that we have in Hong Kong. It very much depends on the needs, the requirements of a particular city to make it into, as was talked about before, a smart, sustainable city.
Yeah, could I just say something about that too? I mean, Lincoln was being a little bit diplomatic there. I think whether it's an 80-story building or not, I think every city needs to have concentrated development around its rail stations, and every city needs to have a metro system. Every city bigger than 1 million people absolutely must have a metro system, because the congestion that arises if you don't have becomes unsustainable, completely uneconomic. I mean, there are numbers that I think are a significant underestimate at the moment. For example, in let's pick Jakarta, which says that congestion in Jakarta knocks 5% off GDP. I mean, that's just, and you think, of course, Indonesia is the biggest economy in ASEAN. What's it, about half the UK economy? Pretty soon it'll be double. to knock off 5% because you have congestion is completely untenable. So you must have public transport. You must have, in particular, metro rail, and then the high speed to connect the groups of cities, the city regions, and so on and so forth. And you must have concentrated development above the stations. And if you're not doing, and around the stations, walking distance or cycling distance of the station, and if you're not doing that as in a value capture model, it's a complete economic waste.
Yeah.
So Hong Kong has definitely shown the way here in the modern era. I think the Brits have forgotten about the railway hotels. Completely shown the way here in the modern era. And other cities all over the region, and indeed all over the world ought to learn from it and do it. Every city that you go to will say, well, we can't do that because we've got regulations that prevent our rail company from interacting with property and so on and so forth. Well, change the regulations. Change them so that you can do it. Hong Kong is a model in that respect, and I think every other city needs to learn.
Just very quickly make one point on that. We absolutely support that because this business model has worked well, not just for MTR, but for Hong Kong and the commuters in Hong Kong. And we're seeing that model being replicated in many cities and countries around the world now. We're seeing it in Australia. We're seeing it in the UK. We're seeing it in mainland China. We're seeing it in Beijing. We're seeing it in Hangzhou, in Shenzhen, etc. I'd like to make a further point on sustainability, though, which is many people think once you spent the billions of dollars building a metro rail network and the system, that's the end of it. It so goes and runs by itself perfectly forever and a day. Our experience is that the cost to maintain, upgrade, and replace the various parts of that system over a 40, 50-year life would be multiples, 3, 4 times the initial capital expenditure. So we're talking about sustainability not just in terms of building or putting in the initial capex, but that very long 40, 50 years of operation that requires continuous sustainability.
You need to go talk to New York City, I think. James, you had one last thing, and then I'm going to...
Yeah, sorry, just two things. In the one in terms of value capture, and we talked there around sort of urban rail, where absolutely agree with the model of having that within a sort of an integrated kind of evaluation of a project, and usually having some kind of connection between whoever integrates the rail, integrating the real estate piece, but also when you're looking at some of these larger, longer distance rail developments that we're seeing in the region, then that will have a broader impact on land values and, in some respects, not to overexpand it, but sort of country values. And you're going to see, as a result of that, some of the, I think, quite material changes in terms of where things like primary manufacturing locates, where you have logistics, commercial real estate development locating, as some of these areas become more connected, especially with mainland China. The second point that I was going to make, I think I've forgotten.
Okay. No, nice segue. Thierry, we're talking about putting in rail that is extremely expensive. We're talking about private sector often getting involved, but what will often catalyze this is a bit of a push from the multilateral development bank. So how is AIB looking to work with the private sector, and how are you trying to have that multiplier effect in the region in particular, in Asia?
Okay, thanks. Talking about railway, I did say before that the bulk of infrastructure is actually financed by public money. If you take the example of building a railway between Kunming and Vientiane, the cost is estimated to be between $8 and $10 billion. You have to compare that to the GDP of Lao PDR, which was in 2015 $15 billion. So it's just impossible for Lao PDR to support financing this railway. So you need other players. And indeed, the private sector is welcome. But there are 3 major challenges for the private sector. One is maturity. The second is construction risk. And the third is local currency financing. Maturity because the traditional players, the major banks, have a major issue in capital cost. which makes it more and more difficult to provide long-term financing, which is badly needed for infrastructure. That's one. Second, the construction risk. So with regard to maturity, we are happy to step in. We can lend up to 25 years, which is generally the right period for hard infrastructure. The second one is construction risk. The ideal formula would be for us to take the construction risk and then to hand over to the private sector for so-called greenfield infrastructure. We are working on those mechanisms. There's nothing I can say specifically, but we are working on such mechanism which will help us attract what we call the non-traditional lenders, which includes asset managers, pension funds, and insurance companies. We hope to achieve that. This has failed by the other multilateral development banks who were not able to attract the non-traditional lenders. We are trying to achieve that. The third point is local currency financing. This is critical. Most of the infrastructure we are talking about, once they are built, they generate revenues locally, which means in the local currency. To avoid any currency mismatch, you need to provide as much as possible long-term local currency financing. This is an area where multilateral institutions have the capacity or can explore the capacity or develop the capacity to offer that to therefore attract the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you tell us, I want to just follow on a little, could you tell us how you are working with the other you're the sort of new kid on the block. How are you working with the existing, I mean, some people have said you're maybe a competitor to the World Bank, but how is that relationship going to work?
It works very well. Currently, about 75 of our projects are co-financed with the World Bank, the IFC, EBRD, and ADB, and EIB.
75%?
75%. This is because we are building a new bank, so we need to build our own capacity to be able to finance projects by ourselves. But we are doing a few. Since you asked about the World Bank, they are more than happy to see us come in, because as you know, they have a major headroom constraint. They will need a capital increase. The US is against it. So their capacity is limited to $20 billion per year, which is small compared to the needs. And so they are more than happy to attract us in filling gaps in their infrastructure projects, mainly in Asia. The others too are very happy to see us join. As I said, with 1 trillion per year infrastructure gap, there is need for maximum players as opposed to fewer players.
I'd like to, thank you. I'd like to bring it back a little to One Belt, One Road, or Belt and Road Initiative, as it's now called, with John. How does the UK fit into, we're laughing about New Zealand, but the UK is also quite far along that belt, not the road. How is it fitting into this initiative, do you think?
Sure. You call New Zealand is the beginning of the Belt and Road, but I will claim London or UK is the end of the Belt and Road.
Okay.
Yeah. I think this is important. London is always the gateway to Europe. Back to your previous questions about what is Hong Kong is going to be. And I think if you look at London and Hong Kong, it's pretty much is a reflect mirror in different places. Hong Kong has got a very mature law, has got all the best talented people in this part of the world. And basically their experience on doing business and dealing with on the finance, but which is, we all got that in London as well, in UK as well. Hong Kong is a very special place because it used to, and probably still are, acting as the gateway to China and rest of the world. And with the Brexit coming, London probably likely to have the same kind of position. Yeah, acting a gateway between Europe and rest of the world. Especially most important to Belt and Road, because it's most Chinese or Asia investor go to invest in Europe, they will think about London. Last year, there is about £40 billion of investment into Europe, more than 53% gone to UK, and there's an obvious reason. Asian investors are more comfortable coming to UK, coming to London. And we see the Belt and Road end with many signals. We got now the deep sea port in east of London. We also have the first running train all the way from Yiwu to Barking, East London, which is 10 minutes from where we are. And with all those things, we can actually see signaling, and also there's more cooperation with Manchester to direct with China as well. So we already see the end of Belt and Road is in UK and in London.
I'm going to open up for questions in about 5 or so minutes, so you can start thinking about your questions now. And I really prefer, well, I insist on questions, not statements, so not long-winded advertisements or statements, please. And if you go into a long-winded advertisement or statement, I'll cut you off and ignore you. Except for you can have your say, except for you, since you were so eager. Not yet, 5 more minutes. But in 5 or so minutes, I want to hear what you think Hong Kong's role in the Belt and Road Initiative is. Just that topic. Yeah, and if you have a question, you can ask it as well. But no statements. Besides the first one. I have a question for the whole panel, and feel free, all of the panel, to weigh in on this. We were talking about the 1 trillion infrastructure gap, but in that we're talking almost entirely about physical infrastructure, I think. I'm quite interested in the intangible infrastructure, the idea of how you get goods and services flowing more freely through this region. And I want to ask all the panelists if you have any thoughts on this. So I'm thinking in that things like standardization of trade practice, ease of, like the APEC card is a good example I can think of. A very small example, but the APEC business card, many of you in the room probably have it, allows you to go very quickly through customs without a visa into many of these countries. Can you guys tell me where you see real opportunities or real possibilities when it comes to the intangibles, like, say, the APEC card? Well,
I was just thinking when we're hearing about London being at one end of the Belt and Road. I hope it is. I live in London. It'd be nice to know that I could catch a train to Beijing, but
you'll have to change a couple of times.
Yeah. Well, there's a rail gauge problem.
Exactly. There is.
Luckily,
which will never be solved because it's a military issue. Actually, the rail gauge is all about military. You don't want to allow anyone to be able to invade your country with a train very easily. So you change the gauge at the border.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway,
luckily we built the high-speed rail that links to the Channel Tunnel. So at least now you can get to Paris for lunch.
You can invade France easily.
Yeah. But in terms of disopportunity, if that's the word, there's the very real threat. It was discussed this morning, and Paddy Ashdown was getting worked up about it. There's a very real possibility of some form of customs border, which I guess is going to your question, which would be a really terrible idea. The logistics are just not there to be able to support it. And I can't imagine what the so-called technological solution would be to solve the problem on the Irish border, let alone anywhere else. So that's a problem with UK at the moment and Europe. But actually, the other side of that is what we need to do. We need to continue to work away at reducing customs borders and move towards real free trade. So, any support, and all of the private sector players in the room, would support that. And with the rate of development that we're seeing in the world and in Asia particularly, there is the opportunity to to continue, I would say, to dismantle customs and tariff borders, to really free up the movement of goods and people across borders, such that borders become less relevant.
How about, James, you had?
I was going to say, a couple of points quite specifically to maybe the development of infrastructure, and then one of the points you made earlier around mobilization of institutional capital. I think the first thing, we see a lot of variation around risk allocation for projects for ostensibly the same sector, but in different countries, and then how that is then documented. And then that makes it quite inefficient for either investors or capital to be considering different projects in the same sector in different countries, and can often lead to effective an arbitrage by different investors because they'll concentrate on Indonesia because the risk allocation is more familiar, more favorable than, say, Vietnam. So some consistency there would be, I think, important, and break down some of those barriers that certainly when you're looking at cross-border investment flows in infrastructure would be positive. I think the second point is around when you're looking at trying to mobilize local currency institutional capital into different markets, you do have different regulations on some of those natural providers of long-term capital. So if you go to Vietnam, a local insurance company will have a different set of regulations around what it can and can't invest in compared to if you go to Indonesia and then if you go to Malaysia. And that's really influencing the rate of change in development and mobilization of some of those local capital forms of institutional money into infrastructure in those markets.
Well, the name of the game with regard to soft infrastructure is harmonization. Of trade harmonization, regulation harmonization, standard harmonization, but it's a long way.
Barcodes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even ASEAN is miles away from this, aren't they? They've been trying for a long time and not really managing it. Okay, it's your time. I want to hear from you. What you think? Two things. All right, yeah. Yeah, it's coming.
What's the first one? You want me to?
I want you to say, what's Hong Kong's role in the Belt and Road Initiative?
Oh, not in the phase 1, phase 2. If you look at what China is doing in the Belt and Road, now even China's investment has stalled. The reason is, if you look at the Belt, which was a lot of former Soviet Union countries, so they're all landlocked. So the China building the railway is a gift from heaven for them. So they like it. And there is no political meddling. But on the roads, huge political problem. Number one, you have the United States, even India try to meddle with the Chinese politically. And then on the commercial or technology side, the Japanese is going to compete with China. So China is having headwind in the road. And that's why, and also the political risks are too high. Because you may flip, like Philippines, it used to be pro-American, now it's pro-China. But what happened? It flipped again. So China, what I'm asking this conference, what's missing is that you don't have the digital technology or the future. Look at the largest company are all technology companies, Apple, Google, blah, blah, blah. So you build all your infrastructure, the Americans come in and reap the profit. When you say about connectivity, you only connect physical. You don't talk about connecting people. How do you connect people? Cell phones, telecoms, right? So the conference should also concentrate on that part. There's nothing there, nothing. Who are these guys, right? And they will come in. You should
talk to the conference organizers.
Yeah,
I'm just the moderator.
And secondly, what you are missing, also the Greater Bay Area. Because China is going to be a Greater Bay Area which can compete with ASEAN. They're going to build it to $4.5 trillion economy in 20 years. Now, the other one on the Belt and Road is because of the problem along the road, and China decided, why don't we just improve soft string, right? Soft string, like maritime, transportation, satellite communications, 5G, so that there's less headwind over there. And the Greater Bay Area, even the Hong Kong government announced, they will concentrate on the maritime, because if you look at trade, ASEAN got a big problem. It's all connected by sea and thousands of miles, right? This is a big challenge.
So can I condense your answer to my question?
Okay.
Maritime,
Hong Kong can play a good role. And secondly, China will come in partnership with Hong Kong to soften up the China, what we call phobia, or China sensitivity.
I understand, yeah.
You understand?
Good.
So you see in the next 20 years, Hong Kong will play a very important part in the Belt and Road and also the Greater Bay Area.
Great.
That's what I'm trying to point out.
Thank you very much. Now,
Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
I'm going to take issue with you.
Oh.
The Jerry Springer, right? the 1 trillion infrastructure gap in Asia that Thierry referred to. My calculation was 900 million, but I'll take some inflation.
That's per year, right?
Per annum.
Yeah.
Includes telecoms and the infrastructure through which digital operates. It doesn't include, you know, the Huaweis and the Apples, but it includes the infrastructure. So sorry we haven't spoken about it, but it is definitely in those numbers, and it's definitely part of infrastructure. And on the gap side, you know, ADB's number I think is 1.7, 1.8 total demand for infrastructure per annum, trillion in Asia. That wasn't a very logically put together sentence. Of which, again, the infrastructure to support digital is a very important component. And unlike the other components, are less problematic. And they're less problematic because the private sector can see what it is, they can invest in it, they are investing in it. The gap isn't, there's not much of a gap there, only in Laos and places like this. Everywhere else, the private sector is already operating, you know, problem solved. We're concentrating on the sectors where there is a bigger problem in terms of supply and demand. And they are, well, the worst is water and sanitation, but it proceeds from water and sanitation through transportation to power and then telecoms.
Yeah. Questions, please. So there's one at the very back. Looks like, yeah.
Hi, Martin Murray from Asia Matters in Ireland, actually, south of the border. Could I ask you, if Brexit talks fail, what do the panel think this will mean for the integrity of the UK and the future of UK-Asia trade partnership? Thank you.
Who wants to approach that?
Wow.
Maybe that depends what you mean by fail. I think everybody talk about we are divorcing with Europe. So it is about what is the deal. And when you say fail, it means what? We don't get out or we get out? No deal. I don't think there's an option for no deal. Divorce, got to have a deal, or otherwise you continue with the process. You can't have no deal. And we are very confident that both Europe and UK want to come to a position that will work both of us in terms of benefit. To let you know that it's more than 40% of the finance actually come through London, come through UK. I wouldn't thought that it would be a light say to say, no, it will go to Europe only, because it won't happen. All this investment would just go away from not UK, but also rest of the Europe as well. Remember, UK is only one country, but it's one of the biggest GDP of the whole group. And they will see that it's vitally important to continue work with us, even through this hard divorce negotiation. But that must be a deal. I trust that.
Question here from one of our colleague panelists.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just one statement. DHL, for example, is a huge data company. So the industry is constantly moving, converging. The reason why we invest over $360 million in Malaysia for our data center is just that. But we are also seeing Alibaba, Amazon become a logistics company. So just as a statement, there's a lot of movement. You don't need to have an old-fashioned telco on the panel anymore. But question to the panel, because we talked about more and more people moving into cities, and Asia will have probably the largest number of mega cities very soon, probably already has. So how about cargo? What's the concept of cargo? Because you need to ship more and more stuff and supply all these people living in mega cities. We talked about MTR for passengers, but how about the cargo concept? And is there anything in the AIB, some projects in the pipeline as well?
for cargo specifically? Are you looking at movement?
Well, the answer is that we are working on what we call a transport policy, which will look at alternative solutions. One aspect you didn't touch upon is actually climate change and the CO2 impact, and to find ways to reduce it, which includes better transportations or better means to exchange goods, which are less carbon print heavy.
Yeah, I think the other thing on that is if you look at some of the very large infrastructure spend that's going on, take Asia as an example, a lot of that is within heavy rail. Obviously there's a passenger element, high-speed rail, but if you look at, say, what's going on through Malaysia for double tracking, etc., it's around being able to facilitate, upgrade the rail infrastructure for cargo traffic. Likewise, a lot of the significant road and port infrastructure that's happening in a lot of, somewhere like Bangladesh in terms of upgrading the port, in terms of trying to build the road infrastructure between Dhaka and the port, is specifically focused on the fact that it can take 2 hours or it can take 12 hours to get from the port to Dhaka with goods.
Okay, I'm sorry that's all we have time for, but I'd just like to really thank the excellent panelists, made my job very easy, and I'd like to thank all of you, great audience, and thank you Asia House, and thank you.